Billionaire waited alone every Christmas until a single mom knocked on his door. "Don't call me Dad. You're not even human to me anymore." That was the last thing his son ever said before slamming the door and walking out into the snow. Inside that Boston mansion, under the cold glow of Christmas lights, Ethan Miles, once hailed as a billionaire who saved millions, stood frozen, realizing he couldn't even save his own family. For 5 years, he lived in silence, surrounded by wealth but starved of love. And on one Christmas Eve, when he finally whispered that he might stop waiting, there came a knock at the door. What would you have done in his place? Open it, or let the silence win again? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive, and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes and help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from, so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you what happened the night he opened that door. Ethan Miles, 42, founder and CEO of Miles Biohealth, was once a hero in Boston's medical world. Forbes had called him the man who saved millions but couldn't save his own family. For the public, he was brilliant, composed, and powerful. But behind the glass walls of his mansion on Beacon Hill, he was nothing more than a ghost wearing a tailored suit. 5 years had passed since that night, yet the echo of those words still haunted the marble halls. Every Christmas Eve, Ethan followed the same ritual. He poured himself a glass of scotch, stood by the tall window, and watched the city lights blur through falling snow. Outside, Boston glowed with celebration. Inside, the silence was suffocating. The house was flawless, every surface shining, every corner staged like a magazine cover. A towering silver and white Christmas tree stood in the corner, elegant and lifeless. There were no gifts beneath it, no laughter, no sound beyond the slow ticking of the clock. The fireplace hadn't been lit in years. The air smelled faintly of oak and absence. He lifted the glass but didn't drink. His reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and something in them had gone dim. Not anger, not even sorrow, just emptiness, the kind that settles in after you've run out of tears. From outside came the muffled sound of church bells and the faint laughter of strangers. Someone was living the life he used to have. Ethan stood there, unmoving, a man surrounded by everything money could buy, but starved of the one thing it couldn't. He spoke softly into the air. I'm not sure who he was talking to. Maybe this year, I'll stop waiting. His voice cracked, swallowed by the stillness. For a moment, he thought he might mean it. Then, somewhere deep within that silence, a sound cut through. Knock, knock, knock. He froze. The sound echoed strangely against the marble floor, so out of place that for a moment he thought he imagined it. The house had not heard a visitor in years. He turned toward the door, heart thudding faintly under his ribs. Then came another knock, softer, followed by a shaky voice carried through the cold. Please, someone's hurt. I need help. Ethan hesitated, every instinct fighting against movement. Then, slowly, he set down the glass and walked down the long hallway. His footsteps echoed a rhythm of disbelief. At the door, he rested his hand on the brass handle, the metal biting cold against his skin. He took a breath and opened it. The winter air rushed in like a wave. Snow whirled under the porch light, coating the steps in white. There, On his doorstep stood a young woman, maybe 30, with pale hair plastered to her face beneath a wool hat. She was trembling, her breath coming in sharp clouds. In her arms was a small girl, maybe 7, wrapped in a pink coat too thin for the storm. The child held a tiny puppy wrapped in a torn blanket, its small body shaking. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The woman's lips parted, her voice weak. "My car, it slid off the road. The phones are dead. You were the only house with lights on." Ethan didn't answer. He just looked at them, 2 figures drenched in snow, standing on the edge of his world. Then the little girl lifted her eyes to him and whispered softly, "Please, mister. He's cold." Without another thought, Ethan stepped aside. The woman carried her child across the threshold, the door closing softly behind them. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and endless. Inside, for the first time in 5 years, warmth found its way back in. For a long second, Ethan just stood there, unsure what to do with the sight of 2 strangers dripping snow on his polished floor. The echo of the closing door lingered behind them, sealing the storm outside, but trapping something unfamiliar inside presence. Grace clutched her daughter tighter, her voice small but steady as she said they just needed a minute to warm up. Ethan nodded, though his throat felt locked. He gestured toward the living room and walked ahead, afraid that if he met their eyes, he might feel something he wasn't ready for. Grace helped Lila out of her wet coat, revealing a faded pink sweater clinging damply to her shoulders. The little girl's lips were trembling, yet her gaze darted everywhere, curious and unafraid. When she spotted the tall Christmas tree in the corner, she whispered to her mother that it looked lonely. Ethan heard her. Though she hadn't meant him to, he felt the words like a pulse in his chest. For years, that tree had stood as decoration, not celebration. He had paid someone to set it up every December, then left it untouched until January, when another team came to take it down. Ethan moved quickly toward the fireplace, striking a match with fingers that shook more than he wanted them to. The flame caught slowly, crackling to life. Grace's eyes followed his movements, quiet, observant. She didn't speak, but her presence seemed to fill the silence that had once been his shield. He turned toward her and murmured that there was hot cocoa on the stove. Grace smiled faintly, thanking him with her eyes more than her voice. In the kitchen, he poured the cocoa into 2 mugs. He hesitated before choosing a third. Smaller one, the same cup his son had once used. His hand paused over it. Then he took it anyway. When he returned, Lila's eyes brightened at the sight. She clapped her small hands softly, and her gratitude came out in a whisper. Ethan watched her drink, her small fingers wrapped around the mug, and something in him broke a little more. Grace accepted her cup politely. She asked if he lived here alone. Ethan answered with a simple yes. Nothing more, but she caught the way his jaw tightened after saying it, like the word itself had sharp edges. She didn't ask another question. Lila, meanwhile, had discovered the tree. She crouched near it, staring at the silver ornaments that reflected her face. Then she turned toward him. "Why are there no presents, mister?" The question landed gently, but sank deep. Ethan didn't look at her right away. He set his cup down, cleared his throat, and finally said, "Because there's no one left to open them." His tone was soft, matter-of-fact, yet it carried the weight of every Christmas he'd spent in silence. Grace's eyes softened, her hands folding in her lap. She didn't say she was sorry, and that was somehow kinder than pity. Ethan busied himself with details, offering them towels, adjusting the thermostat, finding a blanket for the couch. Each gesture felt clumsy, almost foreign, like remembering how to speak after years of silence. Grace thanked him quietly, wrapping Lila in the blanket. She looked around the room, noticing how sterile everything was. No pictures on the wall, no books on the coffee table, only emptiness disguised as order. She wondered what kind of loss could make a person live this way. Ethan sat across from them, unsure whether to speak or retreat. He found himself watching Lila trace the rim of her mug with her finger. Her small voice broke the quiet again. The puppy's name is Buddy. He's scared of thunder, but brave in snow. Ethan smiled, without meaning to. It was a small smile, the kind that trembles before it becomes real. Grace caught that moment and held it gently in her gaze. She could see that this man, who looked like he owned the world, didn't know what to do with kindness when it arrived at his door. So she didn't push. She simply let the silence breathe between them. A silence that for the first time didn't feel empty. When Lila began to nod off, Ethan dimmed the lights a little. The fire burned low, painting their faces in soft gold. Grace laid her daughter's head on the couch and whispered her thanks once more. Ethan replied that it was nothing, though deep down he knew it was everything. He lingered by the window, staring out at the snow, still falling across Boston. Then he turned back to them, the mother asleep upright, the child curled beside her, the puppy a warm bundle at her feet. For years, he had looked at this house and seen only walls. Tonight, he saw the shape of something else, a family, fragile and temporary, but real enough to make him feel alive. The clock ticked in rhythm with the crackle of fire. The light seemed softer now, the air gentler, the silence no longer cold. Ethan stood there, watching them breathe. And for the first time in 5 years, he didn't want the night to end. When Ethan woke the next morning, the world outside his window was buried under white. The storm had quieted, leaving everything still and pale, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, faint sounds drifted through the house, the clink of dishes, a child's laughter. For the first time in years, he didn't wake to silence. He lay there for a few moments, listening, unsure if he was dreaming. He followed the smell of coffee into the kitchen. Grace stood by the counter wearing one of his sweaters, sleeves rolled high on her forearms. Her hair was damp and curling at the ends, her cheeks flushed from warmth. Lila sat nearby, swinging her legs and feeding bits of toast to the puppy, who wagged its tail like the world had finally made sense again. For a man who had lived with emptiness, the simple chaos before him felt unreal. Grace turned when she noticed him and smiled. It wasn't polite or careful. It was tired, unguarded, human. She apologized for borrowing the kitchen, but he shook his head quickly, saying she'd done him a favor. He hadn't smelled breakfast in that house since before the accident. She handed him a cup of coffee, her fingers brushing his. He felt that brief warmth longer than the sip that followed. They sat together at the table, the air easy but fragile. Lila chatted about the snowman she wanted to build once the storm cleared. And Grace laughed, a quiet laugh that turned into a cough she tried to hide. Ethan noticed. She pressed her hand to her chest, smiled it off, and said it was nothing, just the cold. But he saw the way her breath caught a little afterward, the way she blinked fast, as if willing her body to behave. He didn't ask. He just watched, quietly worried. realizing she had learned to carry pain like it was another chore. After breakfast, Grace began to wash the dishes. She refused his help, saying she couldn't sit still anyway. Ethan stood beside her for a while, watching the light touch her face as she worked. Her movements were steady, almost graceful, the way people move when they've spent too many years holding themselves together. She asked softly how long he'd lived in that house alone. He said 5 years. She nodded, eyes down, and murmured that sometimes the quiet hurts worse than noise. Later, as Lila played on the rug with the puppy, Grace sat by the window, mending her daughter's torn mitten. The stitches were uneven, but careful. Ethan noticed how thin her wrists were, how pale the veins under her skin looked in the light. He wanted to ask about the hospital bill he'd glimpsed earlier, a folded envelope she kept tucked inside her bag, but something stopped him. Maybe respect, maybe fear of what the answer might be. When she looked up, she caught him, watching her. Instead of turning away, she smiled faintly. "I used to think strength meant never crying in front of my daughter," she said softly. "Now I think it just means standing back up after she falls asleep." Her voice trembled a little at the end. She cleared her throat quickly and laughed again, brushing off her own honesty like dust from her sleeve. Ethan felt the sting of that kind of strength, the kind that hurts quietly. Out of sight. That evening, the snow deepened outside. Grace insisted on reading to Lila before bed. Ethan sat nearby, pretending to work, though he hadn't looked at a single email in hours. Grace's voice filled the room, soft and steady. It had that same rhythm as the fire, something constant, keeping the darkness from creeping too close. Lila's eyelids grew heavy as her mother's words carried her to sleep. When Grace closed the book, she lingered for a moment, staring down at her daughter. Then she brushed a hand over Lila's hair and whispered something Ethan almost didn't catch. "I'm sorry you don't have more, baby, but you have me." Her voice cracked slightly, and she turned away, covering her mouth as if the sound embarrassed her. Ethan pretended not to notice. He looked out the window, trying to steady the heaviness inside him. The snow was still falling, soft and endless. Behind him, he heard Grace's quiet cough again, followed by a long sigh, the kind people make when the day has taken more out of them than they had to give. Then Lila spoke in her half-sleep, voice small and dream-heavy. "Mommy, I wish Daddy was like Mr. Bruce." "Ethan, it looks sad." "But he listens." Grace froze, her shoulders tensing. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she bent and kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering good night. Ethan stood and walked to the window, his reflection pale against the glass. He could feel her behind him, the quiet weight of a woman who had carried too much and asked for nothing. He wanted to turn, to tell her that she wasn't alone anymore. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he whispered into the dark, barely audible, "You're stronger than you should have to be." Grace didn't answer, but a soft, shaky breath told him she'd heard. They stayed like that for a while, two people facing different directions, but somehow meeting in the same silence. The fire burned low, painting the room in a warm glow. And for the first time since his wife's accident, Ethan didn't feel like the only survivor. By the third day, the snow began to melt, but inside Ethan's chest, something heavier settled, the quiet dread of losing what had become his only warmth. The sound of Lila's laughter filled corners of the house that had once known only echoes. Grace's gentle voice had softened the edges of every room. Yet with the thaw came reality, and reality had a way of breaking what winter had temporarily protected. It started with a phone call from his assistant. Someone had seen Grace and Lila leaving the house and taken photos. A journalist had published a story, The Fallen Savior, Boston's Healer, sheltering a homeless mother and child. The tone was speculative, not cruel, but the words twisted kindness into scandal. Ethan read the headline twice, feeling something inside him go numb. Within hours, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Board members demanded explanations. Investors threatened to pull out. One of them sneered over the speakerphone that Ethan was turning his mansion into a shelter for strays. Another asked if this was some new publicity stunt. Then came the message from Martin, his oldest friend. You built an empire on control. Ethan, don't let pity destroy it. He hung up without replying. Pity. That word again. The same word his son once spat at him. He had given millions in charity without ever being accused of pity. Yet now, when he finally gave from his heart, the world called it weakness. Grace found him in the study, staring at the screen. Her face went pale as she read the headline. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then her voice cracked. Small, but steady. I never asked you to save us. Ethan shook his head quickly. It's not your fault. None of this is. But she didn't seem to hear him. She whispered, almost to herself. I can't let my daughter grow up thinking kindness comes with headlines. She went to pack their things. Ethan followed her, his voice low but desperate. You don't have to go. It'll blow over. I'll fix this. Grace stopped folding Lila's sweater and turned to him. Fix it. You can't fix people. Ethan, you think love is a problem to solve, but we're not something broken for you to repair. Her words struck hard. But before he could answer, Lila came into the room, hugging the puppy tight. Are we leaving again? Mommy Grace froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she zipped her daughter's coat. Ethan felt panic rise like a tide. His throat tightened. Grace, please, don't walk out. Not again. His voice broke. Raw and human, Grace met his eyes, her expression torn between sorrow and strength. You didn't lose me. Ethan, you never had me. You were just borrowing a little warmth to remember what living feels like. Ethan took a step forward. His hand almost reached for her, but he stopped himself. Lila was watching, wide-eyed. Her small face was caught between confusion and fear. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, afraid that one wrong move might make the child afraid of him too. Grace lifted Lila's hood and said softly, We're real. Ethan, you can't keep ghosts just because you're afraid to be alone. Then she turned away. When she opened the door, cold air swept in, filling the house with the sound of melting snow. Lila clutched Buddy and looked back one last time. Her eyes lingered on Ethan, puzzled, sad, as if she wanted to ask why goodbyes always hurt so much. He forced a small smile, the kind meant to comfort, but it only made his face tremble. Grace whispered something to Lila that he couldn't hear, and together they stepped into the snow. Ethan took one instinctive step toward them, his bare feet hitting the cold tile. But he stopped at the threshold. Something in him knew that chasing them would only make it worse. He stood there instead, watching their silhouettes fade into the white. Snowflakes drifted into the house, melting as they hit the warm floor. Behind him, the fire flickered weakly. Its light, reflecting off the framed family photo, still cracked on the mantel. The house, once filled with laughter, was silent again. Ethan stayed there long after the door closed, the echo of their footsteps vanishing into the distance. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. He realized, in that unbearable quiet, that he had mistaken love for possession. He had thought he could protect them by keeping them close. But love wasn't about holding on, it was about letting go. He turned toward the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. Outside, Grace's footprints were already being erased by the falling snow. For years, he had lived behind walls, believing they kept the world out. Now, he understood they had only kept him in. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, erasing every trace of where they had stood. Ethan pressed his palm to the cold glass, whispering to the emptiness beyond, "Please, be safe." The wind swallowed his words. Behind him, the fire finally died, leaving only the faintest glow, like the last breath of something that once lived. The silence that followed Grace's departure was colder than any winter storm. Ethan tried to return to his old life, but every room felt haunted by their absence. The house was too clean, too quiet, as if it had been stripped of its soul once more. He buried himself in work, yet every email, every meeting, felt meaningless. Then, one night, his phone buzzed with a message that froze him mid-breath. It was from Grace. 3 words: "I need help." The next morning, he found her sitting outside a cafe, her hands shaking around a paper cup. She looked thinner, pale, her eyes dark with exhaustion. When she lifted her gaze, he saw the fear behind it. "Derek's back," she whispered. "He wants Lila." Ethan didn't speak. He only listened, the way she once listened to him. She explained that Derek had returned, suddenly wealthy, charming, and determined to rewrite history. He had filed for custody, claiming Grace was unstable, financially unfit, and mentally fragile. Ethan's stomach twisted as she handed him the legal papers. He had seen cruelty before, but this was something deeper. Derek wasn't fighting for his daughter. He was fighting to punish the woman who had survived him. Grace's voice trembled when she said she didn't stand a chance. Ethan reached across the table, his hand steady over hers. "Let me help." She shook her head, whispering that she couldn't ask him to lose more because of her. He said quietly that he wasn't doing it for her. He was doing it for the little girl who believed love could make people brave again. The day of the hearing came too fast. The courtroom smelled of old wood and cold air. Grace sat beside her attorney, her hands clenched tightly together. Derek looked polished and calm, dressed in an expensive suit. The picture of control, his smile toward the judge was confident, rehearsed. He spoke about responsibility, about redemption, painting himself as a man who had changed. His lawyer described Grace as well-meaning but unstable, citing her medical debt, her homelessness, and her recent involvement with a disgraced CEO seeking emotional validation. Grace's breath hitched, tears blurring her vision. She wanted to scream that none of it was true, but her voice faltered when she tried. Derek looked at her with a small, smug smile, as if he had already won. Ethan sat behind them, his face unreadable, but his hands were tight fists on his knees. When the judge called his name, the room shifted. Ethan stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the stand. Derek leaned back, smirking. The lawyer asked him directly if he was romantically involved with Ms. Cumb. Hartwell. Ethan paused, then said, "No. What I feel for her and her daughter isn't something you label, it's something you protect. The lawyer laughed softly, trying to corner him. Are you trying to be their savior? Mister. Miles Ethan's gaze didn't waver. No, I'm just trying not to be the kind of man who turns away when someone needs him. Derek chuckled under his breath. The broken millionaire playing daddy. How touching, the courtroom murmured. Ethan's eyes turned toward him. Calm, but sharp. You call it broken, he said, but I call it learning. I used to think success meant saving strangers from illness. Then I met two people who taught me what healing really looks like. It's not in money. It's in showing up every single day. The judge watched him closely. Ethan continued, his voice steady but deep with emotion. I have known Grace Hartwell for months. In that time, I've seen her raise a child with more courage and tenderness than most two-parent homes I've ever known. That little girl is happy because her mother teaches her that love doesn't quit. She deserves stability, not a man who remembers her only when it's convenient. The lawyer interrupted, asking sharply why he cared so much. Ethan took a breath and looked at the judge, not the lawyer, because 5 years ago, I lost my family in a car accident. My wife and son. I thought my life ended that night. I built walls, bought silence, convinced myself I didn't need anyone. Then one Christmas, there was a knock at my door, and for the first time, someone didn't want my money or my name. They just wanted warmth. That knock saved me, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure that kindness doesn't die in me again. The courtroom was still. No one moved. Even the clerk's fingers had stopped typing. Grace's shoulders shook as silent tears ran down her face. Derek shifted uneasily, his mask of confidence cracking. The judge leaned forward. Her expression unreadable. Ethan looked at Grace and spoke one last time. Softly. You don't have to be perfect to be a good parent. You just have to love enough to stay. When he stepped down, Grace covered her face with her hands. The judge called for recess, but no one rose right away. The room seemed frozen in the weight of his words. Derek glanced around, realizing for the first time that charm and money couldn't compete with truth. As Grace turned toward Ethan, their eyes met across the space between them. She didn't need to speak. Everything she wanted to say was already there in gratitude. In disbelief, in the ache of finally being seen, he gave a small nod. Humble, almost shy. When the gavel struck to close the day's session, the decision hadn't yet been read. But everyone in that courtroom already knew how it would end. Grace had walked in, afraid. She walked out, holding hope again. And Ethan, the man who once stood alone every Christmas, had finally learned what it meant to stand for something and someone without fear of losing himself. When the gavel fell, it was over. Grace won full custody of Lila. Derek stormed out of the courtroom in silence, his pride shattered, his expensive shoes squeaking against the marble floor. Grace sat frozen, tears streaming freely, while Ethan stood a few steps behind her, his hands clasped, breathing for the first time in what felt like years. But victory came with a price. By the end of that same week, the board of Miles Biohealth voted to remove him from his position as CEO. They called it a mutual decision. But everyone knew the truth. His name had become too emotional, too human, too inconvenient for a company built on clean reputations and cold success. The press framed his departure as a tragic fall from millionaire visionary to man undone by compassion. Ethan didn't fight it. He gave one short statement to the media, his voice calm. I have spent my career saving lives through medicine. Now I want to save them through kindness." Then he turned and walked away, leaving behind the glass towers, the applause, and the emptiness that once defined him. Grace reached out afterward, but he told her gently that she should focus on Lila. He needed time to rebuild quietly, without cameras or headlines. For months, he disappeared from public view. People whispered about him, some saying he was finished, others calling him a fool, but he didn't care. He had lost everything before and survived. This time, he was building something that couldn't be taken away. A year later, in the heart of Boston, a small sign appeared on the front lawn of his old home. It read, "The Haven, free health care for single mothers." Inside, sunlight poured through wide windows, landing on soft chairs, bright murals, and tables stacked with children's toys. Volunteers greeted women at the door with warmth instead of paperwork. The once sterile marble floors now echoed with laughter, footsteps, and the soft hum of conversation. Ethan moved through the halls with a stethoscope around his neck, sleeves rolled up, smiling in a way that felt natural again. It treated patients quietly, never mentioning who he used to be. The mothers called him Dr. Miles, but the children called him something else, the man with kind eyes. In the evenings, he stayed late, wiping down counters, locking cabinets, making sure every woman who came through the door left with more hope than she had when she arrived. It wasn't wealth that filled the rooms now. It was warmth. The same warmth that once walked into his house on a snowy night years ago. Christmas came around again. The Haven was decorated with paper snowflakes cut by children and a tree filled with pink ribbons, a small nod to a memory that still lived quietly in Ethan's heart. Volunteers had left hours ago, and he was sitting by the reception desk, sipping cocoa alone. When the front door creaked open, he looked up, thinking it was one of the staff. Then he saw them. Grace stood in the doorway, holding a tin of cookies. Her smile was shy, unsure. Beside her, Lila bounced on her toes, clutching a small wrapped box. Her hair was longer now, her face brighter, full of life. For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. His throat tightened. It felt like seeing sunlight after too long in the dark. Grace spoke first, her voice trembling. "We thought maybe you'd still be here this time of night." Lila stepped forward before he could answer. "Santa found you again, Mr. Ethan." She said it like a secret, her eyes sparkling with pride. Ethan knelt, his eyes wet. "No, sweetheart. He didn't find me. He sent you both to do it." Lila giggled, handing him the small gift. Inside was a hand-painted ornament, a tiny door with a heart carved in the middle. Ethan stared at it for a long time, then looked back at them. Grace's eyes were soft, the kind of soft that came from forgiveness, not pity. She whispered, "You built something beautiful, Ethan." He smiled. "Voici des devoirs. You gave me the reason to." The clock struck midnight. Outside, snow began to fall again, light and slow. The Haven glowed from within, full of warmth and laughter. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel like he was standing in someone else's story. He was finally home, not in a house, but in a life that had learned how to open its door. A year passed, but the Haven never felt old. Every corner of the house now pulsed with life, the sound of children's laughter, the smell of fresh bread, the hum of stories being told. What was once a cold mansion had become a heartbeat in the middle of Boston, a place where no one knocked without being welcomed in. Ethan moved through the halls with quiet ease, greeting every mother and child by name. Grace worked beside him, now the head nurse, calm and steady, the person everyone turned to when they needed both care and courage. Together, they had built something neither of them could have imagined the night they first met. Their days were simple but full. They shared evening dinners at the long wooden table, where Grace teased Ethan for his habit of over-salting soup, and Lila made everyone laugh with stories about school. The girl had grown taller, but hadn't lost her wonder. Every morning, she burst into Ethan's office just to remind him that smiling was part of his job. He pretended to grumble, but always gave in, his stern face melting into a grin. For Ethan, routine had never felt like peace before. Now it did. He had started a foundation called Miles of Hope, offering scholarships and medical aid to families who needed second chances. Grace organized the volunteers, and Lila helped decorate the donation boxes with glitter hearts. People said Ethan had changed, but he didn't see it that way. He just felt human again. He still missed the family he lost, but the ache had softened, replaced by something steady gratitude. That Christmas Eve came with soft snow and golden light spilling through the windows. Grace baked cookies in the kitchen while Lila sang off-key carols, her voice echoing down the hall. Ethan sat by the fire, fixing a string of lights that refused to stay on. He watched them and thought of the night years ago when he had stood by that same window, waiting for nothing and no one. Now, waiting felt different. It felt like living. When Grace called everyone to the table, Lila came running with a tray of cookies shaped like stars and hearts. She placed one in front of Ethan, grinning. "This one's for you. I used extra frosting because you always pretend you don't like it but eat mine anyway." Grace laughed from the stove. "He's been caught." Ethan played along, feigning shock, and the room filled with laughter that felt like music. Later that evening, Lila stood by the door, her pink coat buttoned, her cheeks rosy from excitement. Outside, snowflakes floated lazily through the golden porch light. She turned to Grace and Ethan, holding the same old tin of cookies they had used every Christmas since that first night. "There's a new family that moved in across the street," she said. "Can I knock this year?" Ethan and Grace exchanged a look, both smiling. "Go ahead." "Sweetheart." Lila opened the door and stepped into the cold. The wind brushed her hair as she lifted her small hand and knocked 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was gentle, but it carried deep into the night the same sound that had changed their lives forever. Grace's eyes glistened as she whispered, "Full circle." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the girl who had once brought warmth back to his world. Lila turned, her voice bright. "I told Santa we'd help him this year. He's too busy to find everyone." Grace walked over, wrapping an arm around Ethan's waist. She looked up at him, her voice soft. "You saved us that night, Ethan. You gave us back hope." Ethan shook his head, pulling her closer. "No, Grace. You taught me how to open the door." They stood together on the porch, the snow falling quietly around them. Across the street, the lights flickered on in the new family's window, and a child's laughter floated through the air. Behind them, the haven glowed, a home filled with love, healing, and second chances. Lila slipped her small hand into Ethan's, the other clutching Grace's fingers. The 3 of them stood like that for a long moment, their silhouettes framed in the warm light. Then Lila giggled, her breath misting in the cold. "Can we leave the door open tonight?" Ethan smiled, his voice barely a whisper. "Always." And as the snow kept falling, the door stayed open, a quiet promise against the winter, a sign that love, once found, was never meant to be locked away again. From the night a broken man opened his door to two strangers in the snow, to the day that same door became a place of healing for hundreds, Ethan's life came full circle. He learned that love doesn't always arrive with a promise. Sometimes it just knocks softly, asking to be let in. Grace and Lila didn't just change his house, they saved his soul. Because in the end, family isn't about blood. It's about presence, kindness, and the courage to open your heart again. And maybe that's what every one of us is searching for. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and let your echo join ours. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Emotional Echoes so more hearts can find warmth in stories like this. Thanks for listening.